Welcome to the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 1, where we interview Kim, who is a middle school ESL teacher. Cult of Pedagogy is a website devoted to building a community of people who are unnaturally obsessed with all things education. Please visit www.cultofpedagogy.com to find great articles, teacher forums, book and product reviews, and other podcasts. If you're a teacher nerd, you'll find a home at Cult of Pedagogy. And now, without further ado, here's episode 1. So I am here with Kim, and Kim is an ESL teacher at a sort of medium-sized suburban school in the Midwest. And why don't you just describe the population that you work with?
Sure. The one in my classroom, or the one at the school, we have about
type of school.
600 students, 80% free and reduced lunch, lower income population, heavy needs, high needs socioeconomically and academically. And then within our school, our area is actually a resettlement spot for refugees. So we have what they call a refugee intake center, an international center that services refugees who get funneled through the system into our city. So my school has a population of refugees from I don't even know which country. I ended up with 8 countries and 11 languages and a group of 15 students this year. So it was the most diverse group I've had. But Somalia, Iraq, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Burmese students, and then some non-refugee kids who were just in because their parents were going to a local university here. So kids from Saudi Arabia, a student from Japan, and then I had a Cuban student, a Honduran student. I had a crazy collection of kids this year.
Wow.
It was awesome. Yeah, it was awesome.
And is it, I have this on here, is it ESL? Is it ELL? Has the terminology changed?
It depends on who you're talking to. I use ELL because it's English language learning. Mm-hmm. I had a student in my class who spoke 4 languages. So to consider English his second language would be inaccurate.
Okay.
He was on his 5th. So that's why that term has kind of fallen out of use. And then LEP means limited English proficiency. The people, for some reason, don't like that idea of saying someone's limited in any way, even if you are,
Okay.
I'm a limited runner, but
right.
I'm still running.
Yeah.
I'm not fast. I'm okay with it.
Okay, and this is a middle school. I'm not sure if I said that before. So it's middle school kids, 7th through 8th.
7th and 8th grade.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Ages 12 to 15 in my program. There's a big range because when refugee students come into the country, if they don't have academic records, they're placed based on their age. If they do have academic records, they're placed based on what grade they left in their former country. So some of the kids were 14 and in 7th grade in their home country. Mm-hmm. They're 15 in 8th grade here. Mm-hmm. Other kids get placed based on their age. So I had one kid was 12 turning 13 mid-year this year. He was my youngest student. So
how long have you been in this? Actually, how long have you been teaching ELL in general?
1995.
Okay.
I took a couple of years off to try something else. Got a little classroom burnout and needed to spend some time. I was doing some team building challenge course leadership stuff for a couple of years. But I got my master's in 1997, and I taught while I was doing my master's in ESL. So 95 to 97. So I've been teaching since about 95.
So that has always been the plan then to teach ESL, because I know that there's a group within the ESL teaching population that kind of fell backwards into it.
Right.
Due to maybe there was nobody else to do it.
I think it depends on the state that you're working in. I was a little shocked in my current state that you could not get a teaching endorsement or a teaching certificate in ELL. It's an endorsement in the state, and so I thought that was kind of shocking to me since it's a very complex subject area of its own right. So since I started in 95, there's such a range. You can get, if you're interested in public education, you can get an endorsement added onto your regular certificate. Some states recognize an entire ELL certificate. Some states recognize a master's in TESOL. There's programs that, so it just kind of depends on what you're looking to do in the field for.
It's not yet a well-defined,
not in
concrete
not
kind
in
of
this
a
state.
path.
Not in this state for sure.
Okay.
I don't know about other states because I didn't come into public education on a traditional path. I was actually surprised when I got into public education and found out what I needed to do to be allowed to teach kids.
So the ESL teaching that you did in other places was in a private school?
I taught a year overseas in Slovakia. Mm-hmm. I spent 6 years teaching in a high school private school. Mm-hmm. I spent a year at Utah State University in their intensive English program. And then I moved and am teaching in a middle school. So I've taught about every level of education that you can.
Okay. And you've been at this position for how many years?
7 years.
7 years, okay. So what made you choose this field?
I wish that there was some fantastic story about how I got led into teaching, but I got to the end of my undergraduate program and I was an English major, which, my parents were really quiet on the phone when I announced that one. And my first semester of my senior year, I got involved in a conversation partners program at the University of Michigan where I was going to school. And it was one of those things where you meet with somebody once or twice a week and chat with them in English, and they have to, and that fascinated me. I had been studying languages myself for quite some time, Spanish and such, and Latin actually, which is really useful anyway. But I didn't have anything to do after I graduated from college, so I started looking at grad schools, and this area really interested me. So I found a program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Mm-hmm. It's a master's in teaching ESL, and it's a pretty well-regarded program. So I was thrilled when I got in and started. That's where I got started.
Yeah.
So,
what's the job market like right now for ESL teachers?
Depends on what you want to do, but I would say that it's probably the most flexible teaching certification that you can possibly get in terms of you can teach in an intensive program at the college level, you can teach for a private company, you can teach overseas, you can teach at the university level, you can teach at the high school, you can teach for public schools, you can teach for private schools, mm-hmm. you can tutor, there's all kinds of stuff that you can do. So it just depends on what you want to do.
Yeah.
In terms of public education, I think it's becoming more competitive as more people become aware of the population and the need. But it falls in with any other. I think in this particular area in the state that we're living in, a lot of people are doing it as a fallback when they can't get a position in their primary interest area, which mm-hmm. I think is a mistake. But it's what people do.
Right.
So, and then they fall in love with it, and they're a little late to the party, but
But you see that happen too. That once somebody's sucked in a little bit, then they're in.
Yeah. I've seen people say to me, "I don't know why I didn't think of this before," and it's like,
why do you think that is? Though, why do you think that it's so addictive? I guess.
Yeah, I think for some people, it's something I've been wrestling with myself. You really see an immediate payoff when you're working with, depending on what level of student you're working with.
Yeah.
The refugee students that I'm working with who have zero English and they're coming in, when they first show up at school, you're like their mom. It's like you get them food, you get them a locker, you make sure they go to the bathroom, you do all this stuff. And not because they're not sophisticated people, but the language is so limited that they wouldn't have any idea how to even ask where the bathroom is. Mm-hmm. And so at the end of the year to be having, this arguments about the structure of the U.S. government versus their home government, within 8 months' time is incredibly rewarding. And I think a lot of teachers are really looking, as much as we hate to talk about measurable results because you get so sick of talking about data and accountability. Yeah. It's very measurable and very obvious and right in front of you. This kid came in and couldn't speak a word, and now he's driving me nuts and chewing gum in my class at the end of the year. Like, it's very clear American progress. Yes. Yeah. There's, and I think sometimes in other areas it's hard to see that very clear progress.
Yeah.
And here it is right in front of your face.
Huh.
So,
compared to other kinds of teaching, what challenges does an ESL teacher face that other teachers may not even be aware of?
I think as a teacher, as a person who loves, I'm a geek about teaching. Mm-hmm. So marginalization by other teachers was my biggest challenge, was trying to get people to see the importance of teaching these kids, and to, like, I felt like for several years I've been standing with my hands up trying to, like, kind of protect these kids, sort of a thing. It's an exhausting position to be in all the time, and I think that's the biggest challenge for me as a colleague working with other people, is to try and get people to buy in and to really be on board and to collaborate.
Can you think of an example of a time when that stands out, when you really felt like you had to do that?
A couple of one, it really comes from the students, and I had a kid who came in several years ago, and we were sitting in class, he and I were sitting in class, my classroom, talking, and we were just chatting about travel, and he had come up from Honduras, and I said to him, I was talking about how long the flight was. This is so first world. I was talking about how long the flight was from Chicago to Vienna when I lived overseas for a year. No, it's 7 hours. I said, how long did you have to travel to get here? And he said to me, well, we only had to walk for 3 days.
Oh.
And, like, to this day, it still just stunned me how just, like, matter of fact the kid was, this 12-year-old kid, just kind of was like, well, it didn't take long at all. We just walked for 3 days, and then we got on a train, and we got on, all this other stuff. And I just, that kid has always stood out to me as, like, I want to pick him up and say to teachers in a classroom when I feel like these kids are being ignored because teachers aren't comfortable teaching them.
Yeah.
Teach this kid. He walked 3 days to get here. Do you see what I mean? Like, I'm like, this one, you're looking for kids who are motivated. He walked 3 days. Like,
yeah. And if they just knew what you know.
Yeah, most of our kids won't even walk to the bus stop. This kid walked 3 days, But, I think trying to get teachers to see that value in including those kids in the classroom and including them in their own education and I think that teachers are very overwhelmed by just numbers in their class, and they often see an ELL kid as one more thing, as opposed to a person to be included and blended in, and who has something really incredibly powerful to contribute to the class, and that having that information to try and communicate with teachers who are really overwhelmed and teaching the same thing 5 times a day, the same way 5 times over, is very exhausting. To say this kid needs modification. Modification makes it sound like it's extra work when it really is supposed to be the work.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Because a lot of kids would benefit from modification, not just the ESL kid. So let's talk a little bit just about the process. So when you first get a brand new student, no English at all, what is your approach for getting them started?
Well, I have the luxury of being in a program that's designed for those kids.
Okay.
And the way that program came about is I was about 6 years ago, I got a group of 8 students in who all were 0 level speakers. And our at the time, our structure of our school day was that I had them 2 periods a day, and then they were spending 5 periods a day in content area classes with their peers. And there was no, teachers would put them in a row in the back of the room by themselves and ask them to copy everything off the board, and then if they did that, they had success in class for the day.
Right.
If they interacted, it didn't matter. Like, as long as they were docile and did what they were supposed to do. Yeah. And I was watching these kids. They'd come to me first period in the morning, and we'd work, like, I'm a boot camp sort of a teacher. You hit the ground running, hardcore bell. I actually teach. I don't mean to brag, but I'm very proud of this. I'm teaching before the pledge even happens in the morning, and I actually get mad because I have to stop for the pledge, which we all stand up and do, and then we sit back down and go on with what we're doing, because you're just making the most of every
my
time
second.
Is like,
Yep.
And I would have them first period, and we would hit the ground running. And then by the time I got them back seventh period, they were the life had just been sucked out of them because they just spent 5 periods essentially staring at the walls and waiting to get engaged. So I was watching this happen, and we were getting this increasing refugee population with zero English and very low academic skills. So I put in a proposal to the district to develop a program to support those kids. And so we got this self-contained classroom, newcomers program at our school that supports all the kids in the district. So back to your question, I have the luxury of designing their entire education for them from the first day that they hit the ground running.
So you get all the kids for the district now.
We have a class cap of 15, but any student in any of the schools in the district gets bused, who's a 0 level speaker with limited education can get bused over to my school.
Okay. And so they're with you, and they're with you all day.
With the exception of one related class. They go out for music or art or technology or something like that.
Do you also have the kids who are, what is the term if they're emerging out of, but they're not ready for full integration into the regular classroom? What's that halfway point called?
That sounds good. I don't. I should know that because I just took a big test about that. But,
is there like a level number that they're at?
Like level 2, level 3 kids.
Yeah.
We go by levels. So my kids are level 0, 1. Okay. And then there's level 2. We do basic, advanced basic, and then advanced ESL. Okay. Those kids go to a different ESL teacher and ELL teacher in the building.
Okay, so you're working with the newcomers.
Self-contained classroom.
Okay, got it.
And then the other ELL teacher in the building is responsible for their direct instruction plus collaboration.
Okay. So what do you start with a brand new kid? Because I know they come in all throughout the year. They don't just start on the first day of school. So say you've already been working with a group of newcomers and you get somebody who shows up in early November. Yeah. What's the first thing you do with them?
School vocabulary. And that's so hard because, to fold a kid into a class that's established is like so tough. And and that also is one of those points where you realize how far you've come with the kids that you have because like the kids who you're working with, I start literally on the first day of school, may I have and may I go. The kids learn those 2 phrases and then a ton of vocabulary. So you learn all the places in the school you might want to go to and then all of the things that you might need. And they spend the first week asking, may I have a pencil? May I have paper? May I have, whatever they need. And we come up with mini projects that they have to do, that they have to request stuff. And so by the end of that first week, theoretically, they can find their way around the school by asking for help, and then they can get what they need in order to succeed in school just directly. So I start with anybody who comes in with those 2 phrases. I'm not always successful at folding them in, but we use a vocabulary notebook, and the kids get the same vocabulary that other kids do. So I keep that file running. Kind of like if a kid is on their first day and I'm doing a science unit with the rest of the class that they can't fold into easily, I'll give them a vocab notebook and then get to work on that vocab notebook independent of what the rest of the class is doing for a little bit. And we try and get them up to speed with that simple language first and then fold them as fast as we can into what the rest of the class is doing. But we differentiate all day long. Like it's different groups for math, different groups for reading, different groups for, you name it, and the kids are in small groups, even in a class of 15. We're in 3-group rotation all day long. The kids are always in groups of 3, 4, 5.
Do you have any issues with developing, I'm imagining, especially if you're talking about a kid who is a refugee, that there may be major issues in terms of trust and like just them forming relationships with each other quickly in order to do that kind of grouping?
I think because of the limited language, there's not a lot of confrontation that goes on. Yeah. I think the problem becomes when the kids come in with more advanced language, then they'll start saying mean things. You know what I mean? In middle school, when you come in and you have no language, that is like the great equalizer.
Right.
It sometimes will take 2 or 3 months for the kids in the class to realize who has been to school and who has not.
Really?
Yeah, like it's amazing. I have a kid who got to the end of this school year and he is just starting to learn to read. He's 13 years old and had never read before. Just starting to learn to read. And I got a new student in January. And about March, the new student I paired him up with a student who couldn't read, and I said, you need to read for him, so he can hear you reading and follow with your finger. And he looked at me and said, he can't read. And I said, no, he can't read. He's like, oh, okay, But it was like it just had never occurred.
Yeah.
It doesn't occur to them that there's differences all the time. I mean, I'm not saying there's not conflict, but they don't always look at someone and immediately place them on a level and say, this kid can't read, this kid's from, such and such.
How aware are they of where, especially with all those different countries, at that age, do they have a strong sense of nationality and of difference? And I mean, I know that years ago we had lots of kids come from Bosnia, but then a couple from Serbia also, and I always worried sometimes that there would be, that those kids would actually be aware that they were supposed to hate each other.
Yeah.
And do you ever see anything along those lines with these kids?
We have this huge Burmese population that we call a Burmese population. They call themselves Karen and Kareni and Chin, and there's like 4, 5, 6 different ethnic groups here, and they're very diverse and very different, and they strongly self-identify, but we label them as all Burmese. And that conflict was not something I was prepared for because I was not educated about what was going on over there. I had not done enough reading and didn't realize who I was getting. And then we were getting kids from different refugee camps. So the kids who came in through Thailand were not as educated as the kids who came in through Singapore and Malaysia. So it just depended, everybody's got these variations, but there were times this year when I saw a kid or two get into a conflict. And the conflict was one thing, but it turned into a bigger, I don't want to say ethnic, but we might be arguing over a pencil, but then in that argument
there's
over a
something
pencil,
else going on.
I'm going to end up calling you something that I shouldn't call you based on your ethnicity, sort of a thing. And I'm not sure, my students would often make just really funny arguments with one another, but then there would be that ultimate put down at the end. Well, you're, Karen, and I'm Granny, so I'm ultimately better. What always shocks me, though, and what I have come to respect, is I allow the students to self-identify. Whereas for some reason, when I first started, I was bound and determined to tell them, no, you're not Karen, you're Burmese. I don't know why, what was on the paperwork, I would be like, no, honey, we have you listed as Burmese. And the kid would be like, I'm not Burmese, I'm Karen. And I'm like, no, it says Burmese.
And you felt a lot of resistance from them on that. Yeah.
And I just had to get to the point. I mean, or the kids would say, I'm from Thailand. Mm-hmm. And that was the bigger thing for me. So I was like, no, you're not really from Thailand. I'm not going to, why am I arguing with a kid over where they're from? If they want to say, I think part of it was because I taught a number of Thai students who have the most fantastic names on the planet, like Tani Naparampupan. What a great name. And I was always like, you're not Thai. You're not Thai. But when they say they're from Thailand, it's because that's where they grew up and they self-identify. And I don't know why that was important to me to kind of.
But you see a difference now that you accept whatever it is they choose to call themselves. Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't argue with a kid over where they're from. I don't argue over where they're, what. I don't know why I ever did. But I don't think it was really an argument as much as it was just kind of a little tweak, well, your people are not from there, sort of a thing.
Well, and especially I would think if a kid is from a refugee situation, I mean, what's on the paper could be the last place they were, but it might not actually mean anything. Just,
You learn a lot from just listening to their stories and
So that's something else I was wanting to know is you've probably picked up on a lot of just interesting cultural facts or, do this and don't do that with these kids for that. So what have been some of those more things that really stuck with you that you've learned about the different cultures?
One thing for content area teachers and teachers who are not normally familiar with these kids that and when I say these kids, 90% of the kids that I've dealt with have had the same thing. You don't look your teacher in the eye, that's disrespectful. And like in Thailand at the refugee camps, my students would tell me that if they were walking down a path and they saw their teacher, they had to lower their eyes. They couldn't look their teacher in the eye. Mm-hmm. If they did, it was a sign of disrespect and they would get beat with a stick.
beaten with a stick,
yeah,
like, teach you not to do something.
Yeah, right. So, when a teacher is talking to us, Americans, how often do you say, look me in the eye when you're going to talk to me? I need you to make eye contact with me. Look at me. You need to look at me. Look at me. And I do that as part of their education, not because I see it as a sign of respect, but a sign of paying attention. Mm. But my students will walk past me in the morning coming in from the buses and not acknowledge that I'm standing right there. And it's not a teenage thing. This is how everybody in my family for years and generations has been raised, is that the teacher you don't look the teacher in the eye. You don't say good morning to the teacher. You don't do any of that stuff. It's business sort of a thing. And that's true for the African students as well. They won't often say hello to you in the morning and that sort of thing, but the Burmese students especially, and then if they get in trouble, for the love, there's no way they're making eye contact with you.
So if they're in the process of getting reprimanded, which is hard for American kids sometimes to look you in the eye because it's an intimidating situation.
Right. But it's like stare at the ground, like bury your head, shame spiral sort of a thing when you get into trouble. So I have never had a student argue with me, which I've seen a lot of American kids at this middle school. It's middle school. Yeah. But they will argue back with their teacher. I have never in 7 years of the middle school had a student argue with me when they got into trouble.
And you see that pretty much across the board with any kid who's not from the U.S. that they've just been raised to not argue with authority figures,
unless they've been in the country for long time.
Yeah.
Then there's a switch. Yeah. Because I think teacher's authority figure changes because that's a whole other linguistic power struggle for kids, right? So we have a lot of Bosnian students at our school who have been in the country, born in the country, raised in the country, whose parents don't speak English. And so those students are very familiar with how the school system works. Right. Their parents are not comfortable communicating with the school because they don't have the language to do it. So the students take advantage of that. They also take advantage of the fact that the teachers are not willing to call home to their parents through a translator or won't take the time to do that. And so the students will misbehave and do things that they would never, ever, ever in their lifetime imagine doing at home in front of their parents. Yeah. But because they almost run with immunity in the school system, sometimes they'll pull stuff that you're like... We always send home papers for the parents to sign off on ELL services, and the kids will bring them back signed and checked off, no, I don't want my child to have services, and then we'll call the parent to confirm. The parent says, no, that's not what I signed, but I couldn't read. We have parents who can't read their first language either, sort of a thing. The kids take advantage of their parents' lack of education. Yeah. So there's a switch where kids start to kind of, they're adolescents, and so they kind of see where they have a power opportunity and they take it. But the newcomers are not generally that way.
Right. They're not savvy yet.
No, thankfully. So.
And do you interact with the families much with the newcomer group?
It's interesting. When we first started the program, we were moving kids from other schools, and so we had to go and get permission from the parents, and it was an all-day ordeal. We'd drive around to the houses and go and knock on the doors and talk to the parents through a translator. And the Burmese families were totally flabbergasted that we were there, because if a teacher wants to move my son to a school 200 miles away, that's where he's going to go to school. You're the teacher. You know the stuff. You know what I mean?
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there was never any question about where, we kind of quit after the third house because it almost seemed like we were treading on, uneven cultural ground by not respecting the fact that they would
they're just going to agree no matter what.
And that us being there was so foreign and shocking to them that they couldn't understand what was going on. And again, I always worry when I'm telling these stories that I'm making a sweeping generalization. But I think American parents might see that as being disengaged from your child's education, whereas...
Just to hand power over
Right,
completely.
just to say no, But Burmese parents look at it as, I have faith and trust in the school, and the teachers are the people who have the education, and if they're telling me this is what's right to do for my child, then I have faith and trust in that that's what's right to do for my child. So I've had a lot of interaction with a lot of parents in a lot of different ways, and it just depends on the kid. And sometimes for discipline, I have a phone translation line on my cell phone, so I'll show up at a kid's house and knock on the door and get the translator on the line through speakerphone and stand there and talk to mom and dad through a speaker.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, it's amazing.
What's the name of it? Is this an app or is it a number that you
It's
call?
a phone number. Our district subscribes to it. It's called In Every Language, but there's equivalents all over the place.
Okay.
Like other school systems, if they don't have them, should get them.
Okay.
Instant access to a translator in, I don't even know how many languages are on this one, but
right.
I've yet to have a
And this is a person who's on the other line.
You call, you talk to a translator, and the translator, you call and talk to an operator, the operator gets you a translator. I had a translator the other day in Swahili.
Right.
And we had an hour-long translation with this student. I was having a problem with one of my kids, and so I was trying to figure out the problem. And he was great. He was not translating; he was interpreting. So he was really because he got concerned about what was going on in the conversation. She was having behavioral problems at school, and she was making some claims about another student and stuff. So he was helping me out with that.
It's called In Every Language.
In Every Language,
and it's just a subscription that the district pays for, so you don't pay by call.
No.
Okay.
Honestly, the fact that it is available makes it, the students are aware that I can, whereas before I would often get this, you're not going to call my mom, and I'm like, actually I already did, honey. Wait till you get home.
Oh, that's a riot. So, well, since we're on that subject then, I also was wanting to know about technology and how else that's, played a role in the teaching and helped you do what you do.
First I worked for an unbelievable principal who was the kind of person who you would go to and say, look, I need this to teach, and he would get it for me.
Wow.
Yeah. I went in one day and I was like, I need a laptop. He's like, you got it. And he got me the best laptop I could, sort of a thing. He was amazing. He always said, I have no idea how to use it, but I trust that if you think you need it, I will get it for you, sort of a thing. And I adored him for that. But then my district had a competition for a grant, and I got a grant for my classroom of iPods on an iPod cart. So that completely transformed my newcomer teaching, because I could send the kids home with oral language input after the end of the school day. Because the problem is refugee kids are living in refugee communities within the city that they're in. And so they'll go home, and at the end of the day, they're not hearing fluent or academic English, if they hear any English at all. And I needed to extend their school day because they're so far behind. So I would do dictations. I would have them go home and make movies in English. I would have them read to me in English into the iPod. I would send home books on CD for them. I would do particular grammar points, like you need to go and find an example of a comparison and take a video of it and tell me how it's a comparison. So at the end of the school, so after school, they would have some sort of homework that was speaking in English.
And it was all done via the iPod.
Yeah, they would. I had a contract for them, and they would sign the contract and take responsibility for the iPod and check it out at the end of the day, and then come back the next day and return it to me.
And were the iPods all okay at the end of the year? Do you have any trouble
I've
with
had
that?
them for 4 years and never lost a single one.
Wow.
Yeah. So I really do a lot of, cajoling and threatening, and I have a lot of leverage. No gym time for you, no field trips for you if you lose my iPod. I don't know how much follow through I'd have, but nobody ever tested me on it. So it was really nice.
And what was the grant funded by? Or
it was the district.
Just the district had the money?
Yeah, the district had a bunch of money they pulled from a bunch of different departments, and they put it was really cool. They put together a competition. Teachers had to write actual proposals, and so we won. So it was cool.
Once they're done with you, or through they're ready to go into a regular classroom, even if it's part-time, let's talk about what that regular classroom teacher needs to know and how they can best meet their needs.
It's a big question. I think what the most difficult part about that is I'm not apologetic about asking and telling teachers that they need to change the way that they're teaching. And I'm not apologetic about these kids sitting in your classroom. And so, to be completely blunt, what we need to do probably is get rid of all the teachers who are doing teacher-fronted exercises and get teachers into the classroom who are willing to look at small group interactions and the value of that. That's the first thing, is teachers need to change their teaching style.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason being that for ELL students in particular, for all students, interacting with the material is the most important part.
Mm-hmm.
Kids aren't like empty glasses that we just pour stuff into, and then at the end of the day, they dump it back onto a test for us. It's not how it works.
Right.
And so if you really want the kids to learn, they've got to be engaged. And I'm, preaching to the choir, I think, but just teachers need to see ways to break their classrooms down. Stop talking about the fact that you have 35 kids in a class and look that you have 2 other adults in there, because oftentimes there's a collaborating ESL or another aide, and you can break them into groups of 10.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can teach in a rotation over the course of a week.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guarantee that the value for a student working in a group of 10 with a teacher for 20 minutes versus sitting in a group of 30 for 40 minutes is going to be, tenfold.
So if somebody's resistant to that idea, I think part of the resistance comes from not knowing how to do it. So I'm imagining, if somebody asks me to break my class of 30 into 3 groups of 10, my first thought is, if I'm not with those other 2, or if somebody who doesn't know what I really want to do is with the other 2, then I lose control and they just start fooling around. Mm-hmm. So what then is your recommendation to them to help that
I think
go better?
There's 2 things that I would do. One, look at your personnel. If you have another adult in the classroom, it is absolutely ridiculous for you to ever have 30 kids in a group without being able to break that down. And use the other adult any way you want to. If it's an ESL teacher, ELL teacher, they will work with American kids as well. Don't mix the groups up and rotate the groups through.
Is that a misconception, that person is just there for your ESL kids and that they can't?
Right.
Okay.
I think you have to define the relationship with your ELL teacher. So the ELL teacher is there to support the ELL kids, but they can also be used in multiple ways. I think oftentimes I'll walk into a room and a teacher will say, well, what do you want to do with your kids today? And it's like, they're not my kids for this 45 minutes. They're our kids for 45 minutes, sort of a thing. It's like, what do you mean? I don't know history. Like,
Yeah.
don't do that to me, sort of a thing. So I think first, look at your personnel.
Right.
Figure out how you can use the people that you have in the room. 2, if you don't have another adult in the room, then figure out ways to draw in student leadership and make the students accountable. And I say this coming from a position of experience, because I once had a group of 25 boys in a class, all boys, high school, and I could not get them under control. So I actually decided one day to take and break them into 4 groups, and I took 4 of the boys out into the hallway, and I said to them, you are the leader of your group. Here's the assignment. I will take any questions from you, no one else in your group, so make sure that if anyone has questions, they ask you, and then you can talk to me, and I'm going to hold you accountable for this assignment at the end of the day. And then as the boys took it very seriously, because they knew they were going to be accountable, and they made sure everybody in their group was working, and I only had to deal with 4 students instead of 25. I mean, it worked really well. It doesn't work really well all the time. You have to have buy-in from all the kids. And I think in severe behavioral problems, there's that. But any way that you can break that classroom down into smaller sizes so that you're facilitating what's happening as opposed to, absolutely running what's happening, then you'll have more success.
If you could if you only had a limited amount of time and you could just send home 1 or 2 messages, apart from what you've just said about needing to break it up and not have it just be so one directional from the teacher.
Differentiate your language. I mean, figure out what the essential vocabulary is that the kids need to know, and figure out who can know it and who doesn't know it, sort of a thing. I've seen history classes that are teaching stuff like bourgeois and market economy and all of this other stuff, but not taught in any sort of context. And so that language is so elevated for kids and abstract that they never get it. Right. On top of that, they're working in an environment where they're not using the language. So if you're not using it, you're never going to acquire it. So choose the vocabulary carefully, that you're going, the content vocabulary. Then also focus on academic vocabulary for all the kids. Like, I think if you are teaching in a history class, I was watching a teacher at another school do this, and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. It was an AP history class, and he had a political cartoon up on the wall. And the class was half ESL and half American. And he asked the kids to give a hypothesis about what they thought, or a theory or an idea about what they thought that the cartoonist intended when they were writing, when they were creating this cartoon. And one of the American kids raised their hand. They said, ah, da, 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 da. And the teacher stopped the class, and he said, no, I need you to use this phrase. I believe that the cartoonist intended. And so he set up this academic language where the kids could just fill in that end of the sentence. He gets to practice it. He knows that's the level of academic language that's expected in the class. And this was an American kid. Right. Well, then the ELL kids in the room see another kid doing that, and they'll follow suit. Yeah. And so to set that expectation up for all kids that this is the kind of language we use when we're having an academic conversation is the most supportive thing I think you can do across content areas for all kids.
Well, because I'm thinking that in so many schools, you have got native English speakers who do not know how to use academic language. Or, if the kids are not in a household where people are speaking in high academic language all the time, then they don't know how to use it, they don't know how to write it, and they need to have it put into phrases and shown how to actually do that. So I think that would help.
They also won't do it if it's not the norm in the class, because they'll be embarrassed to use it among their peers. But if they can put it off on the teacher and say, oh, well, Miss Kim makes me talk like this, then they don't look as like hoity-toity as they would. So
they're just pretending to be academics for 15 minutes or so.
I mean, it would be my dream to see posted on every classroom wall lists of phrases that you can use if you want to respectfully disagree with someone, if you want to ask a question of the teacher, if you want to ask for help. This, it's much better to say, I understood what you said about A, but I need you to clarify B, than to say, I don't get it. Right. And what kid couldn't use that prompt? Yeah. And then if they're up there on the wall and I'm teaching and a kid says to me, I don't get it, and I point at the poster and say, can you please repeat that using one of these, then I'll happily answer your question. Right. Then we've got a more academic environment for the kids, and I think that'll support all kids. Right. It would. And it's an easy fix. Yeah. For content area teachers who need to teach language but don't know how to, is to insert this academic language into their classroom. And then the content can come. Content
area teachers now are required by Common Core to be
God bless the Common Core,
supporting the literacy of their students. And that is a really great thing that they could all be doing, is putting little chunks of language up on the phrases that can be used. Apart from academic choices that a teacher might take, what about maybe some nonverbals or some just interpersonal things that maybe you think if you could shake something into a content area teacher to have them do or not do, does anything come to mind?
Because the first one that pops out is don't choose any child and make them speak for their entire culture and think that you're then including them in the class.
Did something specific come to mind when?
I had an Iraqi student who, and a teacher asked them how they felt about something, and it horrified me, because I thought, this kid doesn't. I mean, he's 12 or 13 years old, right? And he has his own thoughts and feelings and stuff, but oftentimes they're parroting what their parents have told them, and then what they say is going to be filtered out to the other 29 or 30 kids who are hearing this kid speak for the first time. Right. Their English is limited, so they can't express themselves very well and explain what they want to say, and they don't want to represent. They just want to be there, And that's not cultural inclusiveness, is to just ask a kid to explain how your people feel about it, sort of a thing. And I've seen that a number of times, and it always just pains
You've seen
me.
Teachers do it.
Yes, and it's painful, because I think then I've seen teachers do it and then pat themselves on the back that I'm
because they think that they're appreciating the diversity.
Yes, that was so great, sort of a thing. But I mean, it took me forever to convince my teachers it was so funny because I would listen to them talking about the Mexicans, and I was like, we don't have any Mexicans, sort of a thing, like lumping everybody to. I think as teachers, just become more educated about who's in your room.
Yeah. If somebody doesn't know how to do that, though, if they think that kind of a question is appropriate, what should they do to show interest in a kid's culture without doing that? Mm-hmm. What kinds of questions could they ask, or how can they get to know them?
Well, I think first it depends on the kid's language level. Mm-hmm. So you have to be aware of where they're at linguistically before you can ask them to speak in front of the class. And that's the first caveat. Do they have the language to even respond to your question or to fully understand your question? Right. And if they do, is the rest of the class going to be accepting of that response, or is it going to further their embarrassment? That's an important moment. Yeah. And then, if a teacher wants to know about a kid, talk to the child independently. Don't look for I've seen it. The problem is that it's often spur of the moment in class sort of a thing. Yeah. And kids, especially at low language levels, need preparation time to respond to such a question. And so if you put them on the spot in the classroom and they don't know it's coming, and then they have to generate this language plus this upper end response, the level of anxiety is unbelievable. So for a content area teacher, I would say, if you anticipate a theme or something in your class that's going to be really relevant to one of your students, perhaps have a conversation with them in advance. Check with your ELL teacher and see if they think that it's appropriate. Certainly ELL teachers usually have their thumb on the cultural pulse a little bit more, just because they're spending a lot of time with it, and see if it's appropriate. Right. And then give the student as much lead time as possible if it's really important that they contribute in the class. Don't put them on the spot and make it a passing thing. Let them think it through, have a response ready for you, and
how, especially at this age group when all kids want desperately to fit in and not be different and not be noticed, where would you say the balance is with, if you could generalize about most of your students, do they want to just sort of slough off any cultural identity and just be American, or is there more of a pride of identity and wanting people to know about their culture? Because I think as adults, a lot of times we think, well, you ask them in front of the kids, stand in front of the class and tell us about the food you eat in your country. And I know any kid would be mortified to be different. Right. But is there also this desire to have people know about their culture?
I think there is, but again, it's so hard. I don't want to generalize. I think, and I always think about the kids who their only knowledge of their culture is from their home. We have a lot of Bosnian kids who've never been to Bosnia, but they strongly, going back to our self-identification thing, self-identify as Bosnian students. And with that culture, but that culture is a little bit different from what if you were in Bosnia. Right.
They don't necessarily even know what's my culture and what's just my family. And so oftentimes
kids will cling to things that they think... I mean, I did the same thing growing up. I grew up in a Dutch family. I've never been to the Netherlands, but I was raised in Holland, Michigan. And and so I just thought that everybody ate almond paste all the time and boiled their food until it was brown. That's what we do. That's my conception of what Dutch, wooden shoes and all that stuff. Dutch culture is like. I realized that were I to go to the Netherlands, it would be a completely different experience.
Right. And you'd be the American there. And
and I wouldn't pretend to speak for Dutch culture, but I understand Dutch American culture.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think where students are struggling is they're doing this blend of often when teachers are asking them to talk about their culture, they're wanting to know about this sort of rustic, encyclopedia type information, whereas culture is such a complex concept that it's it ends up leading kids to make generalizations. Right. That then the teacher takes that generalization and then they turn it into whatever their perception is of the culture. And so there's a danger in that. The students, depending on their stage of culture shock and how long they've been in country and all that sort of stuff, may or may not associate with their home culture at all. They may, everybody gets to a point where they actually reject their home culture when they're going through the stages of culture shock, and then they go back to rejecting their host culture. It's just it's a methodical process, culture shock, and so for some people it takes longer than others, and some people never adapt.
Yeah.
So
how do you manage that, especially if it's all happening at different times? How do you manage that as a teacher? Is there sort of a stock response that you give to everybody about I don't know, like if somebody's feeling particularly anti-American one day because of something, is there a way that you handle that? Or if somebody sort of wants to just disregard their own culture for a while? And
I think it just goes back to respecting the kids wherever they are in that moment, and not, saying, well, you've been here 3 months, this is what our expectation is of you, sort of a thing. And so I can't say that I have a stock response, but I have a kid who arrived in December, was here through May, and I would venture learned next to nothing in my class because she was in such a state of culture shock that she was not remotely interested in this whole education thing. And it was incredibly frustrating, but when you recognize that, you're like, okay, I just got to wait this out, sort of a thing. I mean, I confronted her and had conversation with her and talked with her as many times as I could, but until she decides that that's not where she's at, then So I think as a teacher, just being aware that there are things beyond the child's control that may be impacting their education, and being patient with that, which is not always easy. I'm not.
It sounds like you also validate whatever their current state of mind is too, not necessarily tell them that their feelings are wrong.
Right. I'm not exactly a rock star at that at times, though, because like I said, I'm like the boot camp teacher.
You got stuff done too.
Yeah, so it's like, welcome to my class, you're 5 months behind everybody else, I don't have time for this culture shock stuff. Let's go.
Okay, so since you have been an ESL teacher along the way, what have been some of the best suggestions or tips or strategies that you have learned along the way, maybe from other ESL teachers or professional development or whatever, that has made you better?
The academic language deal.
Yeah.
Big deal.
Yeah.
Do as much oral language stuff as possible with students, including structured academic conversations in the classroom, so that they practice them outside of the classroom. In my interactions with kids, it's structured academic conversation. I agree, I disagree. That language. So the kids learn that. And you can't get a pencil out of me by walking up to me and going, pencil. So the third thing I guess I would say is that require students who are in the process of learning a language to speak to you, and give them the language to support them in speaking to you in complete sentences. If they don't have it, it's not a disciplinary thing, but they may just need the support. So offer that to them and say, you need a pencil, can you say to me, may I have a pencil? Those low-level kids need that kind of expectation put upon them, and then they need the oral practice and the repetition. Instead of, oftentimes we're in such a busy state of mind that we just want to get stuff done, that a kid walks up to my desk and I anticipate before they even get there they're going to ask me for a pencil, and I hand it to them, and I miss an entire opportunity for them to learn, which
would take more time, but then it would have longer legs on it for later on. I know that a real common thing that we do when we have and this is maybe for schools where you may not have a really well structured ESL program. You have a child show up, say they're Spanish language speaking, and the first reaction is to sit them next to another Spanish speaking child who also speaks English and have them just be buddies until further notice, basically. Is that something that is ultimately a good thing, or are you creating a dependency?
Well, first, I never think it's good to make a student responsible for another student's education. It makes me nuts. Oftentimes the student who they're paired with is also an ELL student, just more advanced, more proficient. And so if that student is responsible, they're also in the process of learning, and now they've become a translator / interpreter for the other kid.
It's a distraction.
Yes. And so they can't focus on what they need to get done. The other thing is that I'm big on, I think it's good to have someone that you can rely on in your first language now and again. But you learn language by using it and by trying it and focusing it. And even though it's mentally exhausting and taxing and that sort of thing, we need to allow kids to struggle with the language. But that requires that the teachers are willing to interact with the kids on an L+1 sort of a level, like the level just beyond their comprehensible input has to be there. And so we as teachers need to say, I value your language learning enough that I'm going to interact with you on a level that you're going to be able to understand without making this student responsible for your education because I'm responsible for your education. And I don't think we do that enough. I think it's easiest they'll throw a kid in with a schedule, and what happens is the low-level student stays low, and the upper-level student doesn't move up much because they're now responsible for somebody else who's lower than them. Now, I'm not saying never put them into groups together and never have them work together and never have one student help you. I certainly have had a student, where I needed in that moment, what bus number does he ride? Sort of a thing.
Right.
I don't, but in my classroom, for example, it's English all day long.
Yeah.
Because if I don't require it of them, then they're not going to require it of themselves at the middle school level. So,
well, that actually was one of my other questions. Is that what do you know about ELL kids that you wish other people understood about them?
I think the common misconception is that the thing that always scares me when I'm interacting with a teacher in the hallway is that they will see a student do something and they will think that it's cute because there's this sort of, they can't speak English, so it's adorable when they misbehave or when they're chewing gum and I've told them not to chew gum 100 times or when they've, sort of a thing. And like everything about ELL kids becomes anecdotal. And I think a student who's desperate to communicate and is trying to say what they have to say, often the teachers will get distracted by the delivery and miss the message. And that's painful for me to watch. And so, I have seen kids who are trying so hard to communicate with a teacher, and the teacher is so wrapped up in the fact that their English isn't very strong that the teacher loses the fact that this kid is trying to tell them something important.
Yeah.
So I think that what I know about ELL kids is that you have to recognize their cognitive demand in working in a second language is incredibly intense, and they'll all respond to that cognitive demand in different ways.
Yeah.
Some of them will shut down, some of them will thrive under it, but don't mistake the lack of language for a lack of intelligence or a lack of maturity. And I think that happens a lot. And then add to that layer, I think there's almost an inherent expectation of disrespect at the middle school level by teenagers. And so when you get this polite kid, it's like, it makes them even more cute. And, and in my class, people will come in and my kids are just working their tails off and people are like, oh, it's so cute how I was like, this is not cute. This is boot camp. Like I'm so intense about it. I'm like, this is hardcore. We're learning in here, I mean, I think that's what I want teachers to know is that they're doing twice the job of everybody else in the class, even if the result looks like half as much.
Yeah.
I mean, and I contribute to that. I contribute to it unintentionally because I come from a place of respect when I'm talking as a second language learner. I find language to be hilarious.
Yeah.
I cannot pronounce a lot of words in a lot of languages, and so to sit with a Japanese student and have that Japanese student say a word to me and me say it back to them like 40 times, and all 40 times I think I'm nailing it, and the Japanese kid's like, no, still don't have it, like I've been there, and so I have that level of respect. Yeah. So when I have to be careful though when I'm sharing those stories with people who look at the language not from that same perspective. Yeah. Because I'm not laughing at the kid, I'm laughing at the language, Yeah. When kids mix up sheet and shit, it's hilarious every time. Yeah.
Are the kids able to laugh at themselves, or do they get more self-conscious and defensive about it?
They are when you kind of. But I mean, it's that metacognition. Like they'll mispronounce. The kids start making fun of each other's pronunciation and stuff. I had a kid at the school I used to teach at who we were reading To Kill a Mockingbird, and he. Came to class the next day and he was just so frustrated. He said, "There's no alcohol in this whole book." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Tequila Mockingbird." He said, "All week you've been talking about Tequila Mockingbird." And he said, he's like, "Oh gosh." And he got the joke himself, but it was so fantastic. It was like,
and it's what you can only enjoy that humor if you feel like you are only surrounded by people who have a genuine love and respect for the people they're laughing at.
Like I feel like I have license, you know what I mean? This story is totally worth telling. I had a kid, this was a middle school kid, who was in class, and he got in trouble and got sent up to the office for calling a girl a whore. And so I got called up to the office to talk to this kid. He'd been in trouble before. And I said, what on earth is going on? And he said, well, I was sitting in class, and she said that I laughed like a dog. And I said, okay. And he said, so I told her she laughed like a whore. And I said, honey, do you know what a whore is? And he said he had no idea. And so I explained to him what a whore was in the most delicate terms. He was horrified. And then he looked at me and he goes, I don't know the singular form of horse. And like, he was totally serious. Like, he thought he was speaking,
kind of taking the S off of horse.
Taking the S off of horse, and that was one whore. And so he was saying that, because it makes more sense actually in the context. He laughed like a dog, she laughed like a horse. But, you know, and so I went, like the teacher who got written him up for this, I told her what happened, and she didn't believe me. And I said, listen, either he's telling the truth or he is the smartest linguist we have in the school, because no kid could come up with that on their own, of a singular of horse is whore.
Right.
I was like, so either way, you should not be in trouble. It was brilliant.
Okay, so you've seen the questions already, and so you can answer this in any way you want to. 3 best, it could be 3 or less, 3 best and 3 worst moments, you know, in your history of ESL teaching. It could be just one or...
My big aha moment, and one of the hardest things, is that I work with a Bosnian woman as my instructional aide, and she's unbelievable. And I'm an academic in a lot of ways, and so we were teaching some upper level kids, and I wanted to do something along the lines of the Diary of Anne Frank, sort of a thing. Right, so brilliant me, I find in the text of one of our books this diary written by a girl, Zlata.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm an idiot.
Yeah.
Because I thought to myself, this is great. We'll teach it. The kids will connect with it. It's modern. I have a woman sitting in my room who has lived through this.
Right.
And has never dealt with it and doesn't want to deal with it in an academic sense. And I'm thinking of it from a teaching perspective of, this is fantastic. It's updated. You know, the kids will connect. Da, 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 da. And I'm not... like absolute cultural insensitivity, personal insensitivity. I mean, it was a rough day when we had a conversation. Like, I brought it up kind of flippantly, like, hey, I found this in a book. Like, what do you think about this?
So you never got to the point where you actually taught with it.
No.
You just presented it to her.
I presented, because we were teaching
She
partners.
probably already knew about it, though.
She knew about it, she was very familiar with it. But she had, like, to hear someone, I think, from her perspective, to hear me kind of look at a genocide and from an academic perspective.
Curriculum.
Like, hey, we'll stick this in and teach it Monday through Friday next week, sort of a thing.
Yeah.
It was like so unbelievable. I mean, she reacted not remotely. I mean, she just was kind of very quiet. I thought she'd be excited about it, you know. So I mean, I was such an idiot about it. But it was one of those moments as a teacher where I realized that some of the stuff that we deal with and that we teach is still very real, even though it looks like history to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And that you have to approach those things with sensitivity.
Yeah.
And even when, you know, we ended up not teaching it at all because she said, you can teach it, but I won't be able to be here while you're teaching it. And I thought, I have no license to teach this.
Right.
If a person who experienced it doesn't want
to even be present for it.
And that was one of my hardest moments, I think, as a teacher in the school where where I'm working, is just this realization that we have someone that it was one of my closest friends now that I just put that onto in an academic way. Like, I just threw, you know, like, we can just as easily teach, you know.
Right.
Melville next week, you know, it's like whatever, and it was just a topic for me, and for her it was so much, so personal. So
because you've got kids who are probably almost all coming to you, except for the corporate kids, almost all coming to you from really bad situations. Does PTSD ever come up as something that you either have already had some training on, and does it interfere with the... No.
Well, I'm sure that I have kids who are... I mean, we have had kids with pretty severe emotional stuff.
Yeah.
Like, who become intense problem kids in the school. Like, they just never can get it under control.
Yeah.
I think for my kids, I have not had to deal... If it is there, it manifests itself in different ways, like maybe not participating in class sort of a thing.
Yeah.
But I honestly think that a lot of my kids manage really well because I am a teacher of routine. And so it's very predictable. You walk into my room first thing in the morning, there's going to be a question of the day on the board. You get out your green notebook, you sit down, you start writing. We're underway. We have this class, then this class. I don't change the routine all year long.
Yeah.
And I do that partially because I think that structure supports those kind of kids. Like,
predictability is comforting to them, and they can get into it.
We go to the bathroom at 8:56 every single day. Like, every day.
Talk about the green notebooks. What's the green notebook?
The kids have... Most of my kids don't come in with academic backgrounds, so they don't understand the importance of having a math notebook versus a reading notebook versus a grammar notebook so I do color-coded notebooks because at the beginning of the year it's a lot easier. Instead of saying you need your grammar notebook, I'll say everybody get out your green notebook, and then we transition that into having a different name over the course of the year. Black notebooks are a math notebook. And so if I can stand there in front of the class and hold up the colored notebook I want them to get out, then that makes class go a lot faster. And so the kids all know exactly... I mean, I have a set sitting on my desk, and I'll hold up which one we're going to work from, and then we can roll right into the activity. Because I was finding the first week I would distribute, four notebooks a kid, and then I'd be like, get out your notebook one, and everybody would have a different notebook, and some kids are writing in the back of the note. They don't know what to do. So that skill for these kids was just as important as part of the rest of the routine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Every morning, all year long, we write in the green notebook. And for some kids, you get to April, and they're still not getting it. Because it's so, like, every day you come in and you have to do the same thing. And that's hard for them to... They still academically haven't absorbed the fact that this is part of my academic routine.
So they start with a question of the day. So they start each day with a question of the day, and is that like their writing time? Is it a?
It just depends on what we're doing. I usually relate it to whatever we did the day before. So it's something where they have to reference back to their vocabulary or their notes or something. They can usually find the answer someplace else. It takes a while to get to the higher order thinking questions. Yeah. So why doesn't happen until the end of the year. Yeah. But like I might just do a couple of fill in the blanks where they have to find the right answer. Yeah. Put them in. But it's just something to get them geared towards what we're about to do too. So then I'll usually structure it so that there's a question or two about what we've done the day before, and then a question that's oriented towards where we're headed for the day. So they keep this notebook all year, and it becomes a reference tool.
That's a different notebook. That's a different one. Which one is that one?
They have a vocabulary notebook. It's funny because one year it was notebook 2, so I call it notebook 2. Yeah. Yeah, they have a vocabulary notebook, and that one is a picture dictionary that's self-created. And so with the first day of school, we have a bunch of pictures of school words, and then when we get into animal adaptations, we have pictures of all different kinds of animals, and then animal body parts, and then within that, I'll stick in sentence, in addition to the vocabulary word, the appropriate sentence frame that goes with it. So if I have bathroom, the kid writes bathroom down, and then they write, may I go to the bathroom?
Got it. So there's a word and then how to use it.
And then for the non-literate kids, they do that, writing, but then they also get an oral version of it on the iPod so that they can go home and study, and they're not left out. Because you go home and you can't read, you can't study this vocabulary word as bathroom. Right. Because you don't know what it is. So that's where the iPods come in and support their learning as well.
And so this is is this pictures that you give them to glue in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it just depends on we do it for everything from the school vocabulary to like forces in motion. The kids have pictures of gravity and action and reaction and Isaac Newton and all that stuff. I mean, we do upper end content area vocabulary just like everybody else, but we come up with a pictorial representation of it.
And is it just chronological from when you did it, or is you've got like chunks of the alphabet or anything like that?
No, I have them do it by subject. So when we're studying this is all together, and then the next. And then what I have started to do is they turn the notebook over, and in the back is grammar structures. So, like, we start my class with I am, you are, he is, she is, it is. That's written in the back of their book. Then when anytime we add a grammar structure in, past tense, future tense, irregular verbs, all of that stuff is in the back. So that when they leave my class, they have a reference, an English language reference book that they have used all year long, so they're really familiar with it. Because I think handing a kid a book by a publishing company, they won't reference it. But my kids... If you walk in the door, you'll see them thumbing through notebooks and stuff.
So that vocabulary notebook, they pull that one out all day long because it's got kind of
they know where their
in
stuff is.
Yeah. How can a principal or administrator support you and your students best?
By holding all of the teachers accountable for teaching all the ELL students.
Okay, and how exactly would they do that?
Well, it goes on multiple levels. First, provide training for your staff and express to all of them that they're expected to teach these kids. And if they don't know how to teach these kids, they better be asking for help on how to teach the kids. Second, in the lesson planning, require that it's written in. If you're going to modify or collaborate, or you have another adult in the room during third period, write it into your plan how you're going to use that person, how you're going to modify your lessons, how you're going to modify your tests. Make it be part of your planning. Hold people accountable for that. So when you go to observe, don't let them pick the class that they want you to observe. Pick the class that's got the ELL kids in it, that you have an expectation. Pop in and make sure that people are doing what you want them to do. That, from my perspective, I went through this phase where I just wanted to be everywhere because I thought I can't teach every class in the building, and it drove me nuts knowing that my kids were going to these classes and not being engaged, and no one was ever doing, and they were just being disregarded. So, but that starts at the top with that being modeled and expected all the way down. And then when the teachers ask for collaboration time, or when the teachers have somebody, if you have the ability to collaborate, give them time to plan, figure out a way, get a sub for a day so that they can, meet for a 2-week period or whatever, get a sub for a couple periods, get a rotating sub for the building so that the ELL teacher can meet with different teachers.
So that it's not just one more thing they have to do.
Find ways to fold it into the schedule and be creative instead of thinking this is the way that, this is just how we have to do it. But
is there also sort of a disposition or an attitude that you'd like to see from administrators and teachers that would help all of that happen better?
Well, I think that a sense of urgency is lacking from what I've observed. Like, I have a friend who it technically ended up being my boss, and he and I were talking one day, and he said to me, sometimes I get up in the morning and my hand is shaking as I'm putting on my tie because I have such an incredible sense of desperation about getting these kids educated. And I feel like from the time I get up in the morning, like, how can I do this? I have to, that sort of anxiety over. And he's the only person who's ever expressed that to me. And that's sad, but I want people to feel like I said, teach this kid. You know what I mean? It's heartbreaking to me at times to just look out of my room and see these kids just working their tails off and know that they are 7 or 8 or 9 years behind their peers, and they don't know it. And then the next year, after they get out of my classroom, it is such a big, huge water in the face, sort of a wake-up moment for them. I try to prepare them as best I can, but without the support of the content area teachers, that water gets, it's ice cold when it slaps them in the face that they don't have a teacher who's dialing into everything that they're doing, all day long. And so
For the content areas, what you're mostly seeing is, as long as this child is not causing trouble and they're turning in enough work to pass, do you see them more just passing them because
my
that's
kids
easier?
get hundreds all the time in their content.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, what? How did he get 100? Like, I don't get that. But I mean, I will say this. I think the middle school level and even down the elementary school level, like, grades aren't as important, right? Because it's not like high school credits you need in order to get a degree. And so it's not that big of a deal unless the kids figure out.
Yeah.
You know, the question is, are the kids extrinsically motivated or intrinsically motivated? And a grade doesn't always motivate kids. My kids really couldn't care less what their grade is in their other classes. I mean, it doesn't really faze them. But in my math class, oh my gosh, like, you know, they are comparing papers and doing all this other stuff. So it just depends on
there's a chance in your class that they're actually going to get it, and that...
Well, and I think that there's a marker there for them. Like, they earn it, you know. There's not learned helplessness, which I think that happens in a lot of classes where the kids are like, I can't do any of this, so, you know.
What are some of the, apart from completely changing the way that a person teaches, because that sometimes would just require replacing them with a whole different teacher, but when you talk about the modifications, what are some of the most common modifications that if the teachers would just do that, even if they kept their traditional, you know, teacher delivery system, that would help some?
Oops, excuse me.
It's okay.
In unit planning, start out with, if you've boiled it down to, in your unit planning, have a language learning component to it that's content based. So if you have 10 vocabulary, you know, base it on the kid's level, first of all. That's the biggest thing for me, is that a lot of people are like, well, he's an ELL kid. Right, but he was born in the United States. He's lived here his whole life. Your expectations for him should be different from Joe Schmo who just showed up last week. Yeah. You know?
His name wouldn't be Joe Schmo.
But I think that's a common problem, is a lot of teachers just lump all these kids together and don't recognize the range of abilities. And so I have to be cautious when I'm giving advice. You know? So you can't modify the test if you haven't modified your instruction. So you've got to start with your instruction on your unit plan and figure out where you can insert pieces that student can participate in, where you can insert places where they can be held accountable, how you can figure out that kid is actually absorbing the information differently from his peers, modify your expectations for your content, you know.
What does that mean exactly, though? Modify your expectations for your content for that student, meaning they won't need to learn as much as everybody else?
They're learning just as much as everybody else, but they're not going to be able to explain it to you or express it to you at the depth, or even they won't be able to learn it at the depth that the other students will if their language level is low.
So figure out where the minimum is and where, you know, the
like my kids, for example, we do a unit on forces and motions, the 3 laws of motion. Every single kid in my class could tell you all of the 3 laws of motion at the end of the unit. Some of them got to the point that they could recognize and explain a picture. I have a fantastic picture of a motorcycle hitting a wall, and the student said, this shows for every motorcycle there is an equal and opposite wall. It was a great, you know, sort of a pigeon of the rule, but like that's more advanced. Versus my lowest level kids, my expectation was just that they would memorize the 3 laws of motion, and so then at the end of the unit, and so you can figure out a way to get everybody on the same page, working on the same content, but at their level. That's where the ELL collab comes in handy. Or talking with someone to figure it out. But at the beginning in your unit planning, start looking at that. What is realistic here for this kid? At the end of a week, I want this kid to be able to recite the 3 laws of motion. I want this kid to be able to recite the 3 laws of motion and choose a law and apply it to one of the pictures.
Because I think he can.
Because he has the language. I'm going to, for this kid who won't be able to recite the 3 laws of motion, I'm going to give him a fill in the blank where he's going to be able to fill it in and then read the 3 laws of motion to him. So you know what I mean? So there's ways to differentiate that content so that it's appropriate for the student's language level. And you have to do that in the planning stages. When you're planning your assessment for the unit, which is backwards planning, backwards design, which is where a lot of teachers are starting now.
Yeah.
Start with also plan your assessment for the ELLs, and it's okay if they don't look the same.
Yeah.
A kid who, like my student from Africa who's illiterate, could orally demonstrate proficiency on the content without having to do it in writing.
Right.
And I provided a scribe for him who would read the test to him, and he would tell her the answers. That kid was getting 100% on all of his tests.
Because he understood the science or the history.
He totally
just couldn't
got
write it down.
So when you determine your goals for your unit, determine unit goals that are applicable to those kids.
Right.
That they'll be able to demonstrate proficiency in the content for you.
Right.
I mean, it would be a dream for me to please add language goals, but that's where I would start.
Yeah.
Don't get to the end of your unit and then go to your ELL teacher and say, I need this test modified. They can't modify the test for you when they don't know what you've taught. Like, you have to know what you're expecting a kid to learn.
Yes.
And you have to plan that test appropriately.
Policy level now. What changes would you like to see in terms of English language learners?
I would like to see an alignment of our assessment system with what we understand about language acquisition.
Okay, what would that look like?
Students would not be tested in content areas until they're in the country for 5 to 7 years or have demonstrated academic language proficiency on an access test or some sort of a test. Because the current policy disgusts me. I mean,
is it still 2 years?
1.
It's 1 now.
And it's not even 1 year. It is 1 exemption. So, for example, I had a student who enrolled in on May 8th of last year during the week of he enrolled like the Friday before testing started. Well, then he took his exemption that year. Even though
he tested that year.
No, he took it. You get a 1 exemption.
What? Okay, got
it.
So
he got that exemption, took it. He's in school for all of a day, and he gets his testing exemption. Has 1 more week of school, and then he goes on summer vacation. Returns in the fall, essentially starting his first year in U.S. schools, and has to take the entire set of accountability tests for the following school year because his exemption was used up the year before. Even though he hasn't technically even been in school for a full year at that point. And then add to that the fact that there's an eroding system of modifications and test assessment because they're so concerned about consistency, which is understandable.
Yeah. But
they're not compensating for that in any way by saying, okay, we're taking away readers, we're taking away paraphrasers, we're taking away prompting and cueing notebooks. We took down all of the stuff that we have on the walls that act as cues for students who are learning in this new way.
Yeah.
To demonstrate their proficiency on this test because we need to have an even playing field.
Yeah.
The playing field doesn't start even just by taking all that. I mean, it's disgusting to me. I would love to give the governor of our state a test in rudimentary Spanish and just, say here,
Yeah.
But we had an Explore test we had to give to our students, and it's supposed to take 4 30-minute tests.
Mm-hmm.
We had readers reading the tests to them. It took 6 hours for us to administer that test by the time we were done administering the test to the students. So
because you were using readers.
Because the readers and the kids could ask for paraphrases of questions, and they were, at the time those were appropriate accommodations, and the kids were putting forth 100% effort, and we took 6 hours to test them over the course of a day.
And that you'd like to see that?
It's cruel.
To do that, yeah.
It's inhumane. It's cruel. I would pull my child out of school if I knew that my daughter was going to go through 6 hours of standardized
Because you saw, did it have a real negative impact on the kids that day?
They were tired. They were totally participating. My bigger concern is the long-term effect of constantly testing kids on stuff that is so far beyond their reach that they can't do it.
Yeah.
That when they get to the point that it is not beyond their reach, they have learned that they can't do it. And so when it actually might be a valid test for them, you don't get valid results because they've quit. Like, how many times do you want to do something you can't do?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so And on top of that, there's this incredible erosion of trust with me, because I tell my students all the time in my class, I will never give you a test. I will never personally give you a test that I don't think you can do.
Yeah.
I will never ask you to do a task that I don't think you can do. Mm-hmm. I think that's unethical as a teacher to give kids, I think there's stuff that they need to learn and they need to reach for. It's not that I teach above their level, but I won't give them something that's beyond their reach.
Right.
And yet, we are taking several days out of every school year and sitting them in a room now with a CD player or a tape recorder that reads to them this entire test that's so far beyond their understanding that it's contradicting the relationship that I've built with them over the course of the year to trust me. They trust me not to do that to them.
Well, and if you're supposed to present a professional demeanor that this is an important test, and you, I mean, at the very least, you should be able to say, I think it's crap that you have to take this, and then you maintain the trust with them. But,
well, and then, to say to them, look, this year it really doesn't matter, but next year it's very important. It's like, how much can you do that? And so it's soul sucking, just awful.
How strong is there of a lobby to try to change that? And is that just state by state, or is that on a national level?
Gosh, I hope it's not national, because I would hate to think that we're doing this to kids all over the country. But individual people like me get really fired up and try to do something and nothing happens.
Yeah.
And to talk, I mean, there's an incredibly powerful lobby with TESOL, the Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages, and there's the state level TESOL boards, and everybody contributes, but it seems to be that people who are making the rules for education don't understand education, and then you add to that, they don't understand second language learning.
Right.
And so really, I mean, how many complaints about the standardized testing system do we get? It's like, the testing system isn't good, but then I'm complaining about it for ELLs. It's like, well, let's fix it for the regular kids first. I did air quotes again. But let's fix it for the regular kids first before we even worry about how it's going to impact the ELLs. And so they seem like such a secondary concern.
So sort of whatever about them. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So suppose this 5 to 7 year were put in place, and that's that 5 to 7 year comes just from your working with those kids. That's about
no. That's research based.
Okay.
Academic language proficiency requires 5 to 7 years in a second language, provided that you have an educational background in your first language.
Got it.
So kids who have formal schooling in their first language will take 5 to 7 years to acquire academic English in their second language.
This is if they live in the country where that's being spoken.
Right. But you get a kid who comes in from a refugee camp in Tanzania who's never held a pencil in his life. It's going to take him longer than 5 to 7 years to develop that proficiency. Right. We are testing them within a year. Yeah, you just can't swallow. I mean, I don't know. I mean, like, it's so disgusting, and you tell that to people, and they shake their heads, and they're like, really? But I don't know how to change it. I actually had my principal come in, and he said, this is wrong, and I said, I know. And then he had to be a reader on the test.
Yeah.
And by the third hour, he was where I was in terms of fury. Like,
really,
that's what you need. You need
people to be in there doing
it. We need the government. We need the people who are making the rules to come and have to administer this test to these kids for a day and see
what happened during those 3 hours, though. To him, what do you think that build-up was that got him to the point of being furious?
Well, you're sitting there with a kid who clearly does not understand anything, and they're poised there with their pencil like they are just going to run a marathon here, you know what I mean? And they're just waiting for your cue to ask them a question that they're going to answer. And they're intent upon doing this because you're the teacher and you've made, they've got this trust thing going, okay, here we go. And you read the question to them and they are in, you know what I mean? The kid's sitting there and they're like, I'm going to do this. And you're watching them realizing first they can't read. I mean, I had illiterate kids doing this test, and so they couldn't even follow which question they were on, but they were so intent on pleasing you that they wanted to do, and so I think over the course of 3 hours, he realized that this was almost brutal punishment for these kids who, were essentially
You're just going to keep giving them an opportunity, and they're going to think, this time I'm going to get it. And it's like, nope.
I remember reading a question to a kid about, like, probability. Probability questions always have bags of marbles, And I read this whole probability question to him about, pulling out the marbles, da-da-da-da. And we get to the end of this thing, and he goes, and I read, what are the chances that you are going to pull out a yellow marble? And the kid just looks at me and goes, yellow? Because it was the only...
It's like, that's a word I know. I got that word.
It was the only
Is
word.
that one of the answers?
And it was so... And I was so like, yes, honey. Yellow. And I was like, I feel like I'm just beating this kid. My job is requiring me to
do this. Yeah.
Do this.
Yeah.
I can't, I just...
If somebody were going to say, okay, we got it, we believe you, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make that, but we want to make sure our teachers are still teaching these kids. How else could we measure? Are there, and I'm guessing years ago there probably still are, tests of language proficiency or modified tests that test the content, to where you say to this kid who's still illiterate, here's a ball and here's a ramp, show me Newton's third law. And maybe they'd have to be... Maybe the recorder has to write down what the kid did, and it would have to actually be scored by somebody who can read it and not a machine. But are there other ways to make sure that kid isn't just sitting there getting ignored for 5 years?
I would do a dual accountability system, one that would have modified language tests, and I think sufficiently, like, kids who are level 4 and 5 on a scale of 1 to 5. So kids who are level 4 and 5 are pretty proficient, close to peer level proficiency. Yeah. And so those kids might be able to take, or would definitely be able to take, the regular test again, with an accommodation. Perhaps they could have a reader if they needed a reader, or a paraphraser if they needed a paraphraser, or they could use a dictionary, but some sort of just modification, right? Then we would have a level 3 test. And that's a content-based test that has the simplified language built into it.
So that somebody who understands English language learners maybe has taken the real test and has said,
we're going to take that test, we're going to give them that test.
This is an idiom they're not going to understand. It has nothing to do with science, but they don't know what that term means.
I'm not going to put a single question on this test about baseball, because baseball is largely American sport. And so, that happens all the time.
Yeah.
There's stuff about how big is the football field, and my kids are so stuck on what is a football field.
Yeah.
But someone would modify a level 3 test, that upper level test, down to be a language level that's appropriate, and then the kids still take the content test.
Yeah.
And then those kids who are level 1 and 2 would either have an even more modified content test, or their scores and their accountability for the school would be largely based on their English language proficiency scores.
To just get them to be able to take the other tests. Yeah.
Right. And so the goal of that, you would perhaps use a test like the access test and expect that those kids would show 1 year of academic language progress. From level 1 to level 2 would be our expectation. Good, check. This school has done what they're supposed to do for this kid. And then once they hit level 3, they have a modified test, and level 4 and level 5 kids get accommodation.
So much more complex, much more holistic.
Right. Well, and I would hold schools accountable for English language proficiency development. We have a whole bunch of kids who get stuck at level 3 because their teachers are not developing their academic language. And they just sit there forever, in their low-level reading and writing, and we're not doing enough. Well, reading is assessed, but the question becomes, is reading assessed as a language problem, or is reading assessed as a reading problem? And so, trying to kind of, if we're really into using assessment and really into using accountability, use it for good instead of evil, you know what I mean? I mean, I have no problem with being held accountable for my students' teaching, or for my students' learning, but I have yet to see something that could accurately show me.
Well, and that's really the issue. It's that if you have 100 kids and they've got all different levels of English proficiency and they all fail the test, you don't actually know what they know, because there could be 20 different reasons that they fail it.
Well, and I think the slippery slope that you go down there too is that American students if it's a test of academic language proficiency, there's a lot of American students who would fall at a level 3 range for academic language proficiency.
It's a second language,
right?
For
and
a
so,
lot
do
of
they
kids.
get to take the modified test as well? Do we start
Right.
giving academic language tests to everyone? Do you get to test out of academic language proficiency?
If the tests weren't so long,
Right.
it would maybe make sense to give
Right.
those kids both tests
Right.
and see,
Right.
is it an academic language issue
Yeah.
or is it a content issue?
Is it? Because we're really talking about academic language, not just English. And so
Right.
when we, a lot of kids get stuck in
Yeah.
ELL classes, but it's academic language. Well, so would a lot of American kids.
Yeah.
So,
Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like people sort of to know about this field?
I think that you should not be an ELL teacher unless you have talked to people from other countries. And I say that I come from a loving place, but I'm shocked at the lack of. You asked me very early on about the requirements for becoming an ELL teacher, and it's possible to graduate and have an endorsement or certificate in teaching ELLs without ever having talked to someone from another country. I think that every single teacher should have some sort of ELL training and ELL endorsement. And if it were up to me, I think every single person who has to work with ELLs would need to go to a country where they don't speak the language for a week and wander around and get lost and try
to get that humility.
Yeah. I got lost in Slovakia about 2 weeks into my stay there. And I remember, I can remember very vividly just my mind just clicking through all of this stuff. Like, I was trying to find my apartment. I couldn't find my apartment. I didn't have any language because I'd only been there for 2 weweeks. I was an idiot. I arrived in the country with no language. I could count to 10. I was an idiot. And I went hiking with a friend, and we came down from we're in the low Tatras, and so we came down from the little mountain that we climbed, and I was living in this, a communist era housing block with all the apartments look the same, but my Midwestern sensibility said, don't inconvenience her and have her walk you home. So my friend said, you know where you're going? And I said, oh, sure. And she took off. And I realized as she rounded the corner, I had no idea where I was. I walked back and forth on the street for probably 35 minutes. I have no idea what to do. I remember just running through everything in my head and just being like, and the sun's going down, and of course it's getting very dramatic. So
yeah,
I finally pick out this guy who looks pretty harmless because he's got a broken arm and he was drunk. And I walked up to him and I said, Ja som Američanka, gdzie jest Svermova 55, which is, I am an American, where is Svermova 55, which was my apartment. He was so funny because he was like, oh, an American, which is really funny in itself. But then he realized, which I found out a few minutes later, where I was. So he decides he's going to lead me home. And it's evening time in Slovakia, and all these people are sitting out on the stoops. And so as we're walking down the street, I'm walking like 3 feet behind him with my head sort of down in this sad little parade, and this drunk man is waving his one good arm going, look what I found! It's an American! Everybody, look! It's an American! Isn't she a nice American? Sort of a thing. And I'm totally doing this walk of shame down the road behind him. And I realized I'm like 2 blocks from my house. Like, I literally had to turn a corner, and I would have.
So it wasn't a long parade.
No. But it was. This absolutely most base moment in my life of being like, I have nothing but a drunk guy with a broken arm.
Totally vulnerable.
Yeah. I had nothing.
Yep.
Nothing at all. And I think that everyone should have that experience. It will change how you treat your students. It will change how you treat your coworkers. It will just change how you view the world, because you will realize you can go to, as many trainings as you want to, but if, that guy couldn't care less if you have a diploma.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you're walking behind a drunk guy with a broken arm.
Yeah.
So.
Visit www.cultofpedagogy.com and find more great stuff for teacher nerds. Thanks, and have a great day.